gesture with your hands a little higher so that the camera catches some of that.
Okay.
Okay. And you can vote.
So you know what I want to do? I want to take Afrofuturism, African Futurism, African Jujuism, and push them into the abyss. Why into the abyss, you say? Precisely because that is exactly where the work they must do resides. I want to remind you to not forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so that you know whenever we drop new content. Also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where we can continue these conversations and explore Black imaginative production together. And lastly, if you so choose, support our Patreon so that we can garner virtual but also actual space for continued education and imaginative community building. All links will be provided below the video. In the same way that physics begins to break down inside black holes, and as entities, black holes challenge so much of what we either know or thought we knew about the universe, blackness reads as incoherent and without conceptualization in the world. What may be more accurate to say is that within the black hole lies a kind of physics, a kind of understanding that we just don't know yet. Perhaps that which is near unimaginable to us thus far. Physicists and philosophers, in thinking inside or from the black hole, risk turning everything we know about existence in this universe, or maybe even this particular universe, on its head. We might even be granted knowledge that will forever change our conceptualization of, well, everything. I often say that the radical capacity of blackness is that what it must do, what it is in the process of doing, is thinking toward the unimaginable, the impossible, the unthinkable. One of the areas where people imagine themselves to be doing this work is in the realms of Afrofuturism and African Futurism and African Jujuism. I think that by now, most of us know that Afrofuturism and then African Futurism and African Jujuism are responses to the reality that black folk were often not depicted as being in the future. Many black people who are only about 60 years old will tell you that not only was it a big deal whenever black people were even on TV, but that the lack of black people in movies and shows about the future prompted the question, what happens to black people such that we don't exist in the future? This is precisely what made the role of Uhura, as portrayed by Nichelle Nichols, so groundbreaking. However, for many different artists, the future with black people was not nearly as awe-inspiring, colorful, or extra as a black future. While the term Afrofuturism was coined in 1993, the aesthetic groundwork had already been laid by people like Octavia Butler, Grace Jones, Sun Ra, Earth, Wind and Fire, and Parliament Funkadelic. Afrofuturism sought not only to put black people into the future, but to imagine many different timelines from several different perspectives. The fact is, black people don't really operate within time. Time, to put it gently, is not as kind to us as it is to others. When we talk about the important spans of time that actively define life, as in lifespan, black people literally come up short. Brutality often inverts what we consider the natural order wherein parents are supposed to pass on before their children. And history for the black is a narrative of loss and brutality, and a fiction that works to create blacks out of the various named cultures of dark peoples around the world. The philosopher Hegel once wrote that Africa is no historical part of the world. He was suggesting that Africans had not produced anything that could be considered world building. Nothing that will make a lasting impression on the world had ever been produced on the continent or from its peoples. And in order to kind of accomplish enforcing this vantage point, black history was basically created. The borders of Africa were designed by people who were seeking to differentiate themselves from the darkest peoples of the world, not by Africans. Moreover, all over the world, profoundly complected peoples became known as Black, whether they were from the continent of Africa, South Asia, Australia, Melanesia, or their diasporas. For Africans who were extracted and taken to Europe, India, the Caribbean, and the Americas as slaves, this had the effect of cutting us off from inheritance. So, even time, as expressed through generations and as captured in linear stories of families and the transference of ways of being and thinking and doing, is something that no longer applies to many of the world's Black peoples. As a matter of fact, it could be said that where Black history begins, our origin story is in the belly of ships. And regardless of where you are on the earth, dark skin is forever marked by this moment. Prior to this event, we were not men, women, gay, bi, cis, trans. We weren't Black. While I do believe that we probably had concepts for understanding ourselves as queer, anatomically differentiated, and dark peoples, we had our own words, and they fit into wholly different worlds. Thus, our ways of regarding ourselves were held together differently. But the violence has been so totalizing that everywhere we exist, it is hard to reclaim these sets of knowledge. So while it invokes the language of the future, Afrofuturism tries to work from within the atemporal nature of Blackness. In a conversation about her project on the Black student subject and Lacanian psychoanalysis, scholar Khadija Diskin talks about how almost all of the Black students she interviewed felt that there was a shared ground and the Black experience becomes legible through suffering and brutality. But when asked about the future, there was no such clarity, no idea how to even proceed toward the future. Various Black futurisms take this burden on and try to figure out what stories we tell. They ask questions of history like, what if white people had never interrupted Black people? What does the Black future look like from the continent, from the West? What kind of future is possible if our more ancient ways of knowing could be reclaimed? What happens if we never reclaim those ways of knowing? Or even what happens if things get worse, much worse for us? In the way of the horror in movies like Get Out or Antebellum, because of the omnipresent nature of anti-Black violence, Black thought is often tasked with resisting that violence, resting in and wrestling with that violence, all of which does the work of cutting through other realms of thought and pushing all thinking further to the edge, and then pushing it off. Afrofuturism is no different in its scope. As an aesthetic movement, it challenges us to think about what sights and sounds and sensory experiences and representation become symbols for Blackness and help determine who or what the Black is, or how Blackness overdetermines whole systems of signs and symbols that are used to make meaning in the world. For example, Afrofuturism questions what beauty is and where it's found. Can beauty be enhanced by tech, by nature? Artists like Wangechi Mutu and Osborne Masharia challenge conventional notions of beauty, mostly because Black people have been the foil against which beauty is even defined. We've seen articles that purport a scientific means by which to determine attractiveness. In other ways, this also asks us to challenge and think about the ways that we engage nature and technology and knowledge creation. What is considered knowledge? What is written off as magic in the West connotes an arena of thought not to be taken seriously. But because our most ancient knowledges incorporated understandings and assumed the importance and reality of multiple invisible realms that could be interacted with, the line between the metaphysical and physical collapses Western categories of fantasy and science. Afrofuturism does all of this work. So then why do I want to push it into the abyss? Let me start by saying this. I've gotten asked if I believe that Afrofuturism is the answer to Afropessimism. In short, There is no answer to Afro-pessimism. There is no easy resolution, reconciliation, or conclusion that can be reached. Everything that we know, all knowledge at current, has been insufficient in actively challenging anti-Blackness. As a matter of fact, we can actually look at most, if not all, knowledge as having been created in the crucible of anti-Blackness. Let me also add here that it's not necessarily the job of Afrofuturism to imagine us out of anti-Blackness. That's not its only purpose. It can take us into the depths of Black terror and horror. It can remain, for some, an important intervention in everyday entertainment, especially for those for whom representation matters. However, if an Afrofuturist artist does seek to think beyond anti-Blackness or after it, they must be willing to hop headlong into the abyss and find the knowledge that we don't yet have, because it's not possible to head toward the impossible with what has already been conceived as possible. Get me? And for this reason, in many of our Afrofuturist imaginations, we still don't escape anti-Black and colonialist or imperialist logics. With the upcoming movie Wakanda Forever, due to release next month, let's take Wakanda as an example. Wakanda, of course, being that fictitious African civilization that has never known being conquered. I think it's fair to say that we all had very complex feelings around Wakanda. On one hand, psychologically, it felt good to think of Black people who had never known being conquered. Black people who were, for all intents and purposes, unfuckwittable as far as being able to be infiltrated by normal Western, technologically enhanced, violent capabilities. Others of us saw the fact that Njidaka was allowed his birthright challenge as a story of reclamation, albeit tenuous. We saw in it our own desires for reclamation, for belonging, for an inheritance that isn't simply a slave status. But what are the limits of Wakanda? Where does the infatuation with the fictitious land end? And why must the dream come to an end? Some people who voiced their disdain or maybe distrust for Wakanda wondered, so where the hell were y'all when niggas was getting yeeted en masse from the continent? Or after you realize that so much had befallen the world, granted, we see some intervening on the part of Nakia, for instance, but some of us felt that it would have or should have been obligatory that Wakanda intervene on the level that Killmonger or Njidaka had imagined. Or what do we do the fact that canonically, even the king of the world's most powerful and advanced nation was largely educated in the West and holds several PhDs, with one being in physics from Oxford University. Regarding Njidaka, the colonizer CIA operative makes the statement that he's one of ours, referring to both the training and conditioning, and I go as far as to say the ontological status of Njidaka, aka Killmonger. This makes me wonder, could Wakanda ever truly be a solution to anti-Blackness when the two leaders in question are steeped in the thinking and knowledge of the West? Do these facts about these two possible trajectories for Wakanda mean that either way, the anti-Black world as it is now is legitimized? Let's also consider that the logics of captivity still apply to Wakanda. Just because Wakanda had never been colonized doesn't mean that it wasn't a captive land. It does not escape being surrounded by an anti-Black world. In being surrounded and unable to be itself to or in the world, and unable to present itself for so long, it is in a cage as well, albeit a very beautiful and dignity-affirming cage. Once T'Challa agrees to open Wakanda up to the world, it is now set to engage in the usual extraction of resources and knowledge by the rest of the world. So then the resolution that T'Challa rests on is to improve the world, aka the global plantation, instead of destroying it. But would Njidaka be any more able to end the world while being such a part of it, belonging to it as property, and it being inherent in who he was and how he was created? Once again, we see that Black stories don't tend to have conclusions that can fulfill narrative arcs cleanly. We see ourselves in a sort of bound state, wherein Blackness calls on us to bring about the end of the world and whatever comes after the or a world. But that imaginative project is near impossible. So then what do? Do we concede to the world? I, for one, have conceded that the project of ending the world is a worthy task to think about and maybe through. Part of me wants to live now in whatever after the world will be or is, which is why I want us to come together as creatives, thinkers, enjoyers of art and media, as Afrofuturists, African futurists, and African Jujuists, and push the thinking into the void, where there are other laws, possibly more ancient laws, incomprehensible realities, and impossibilities to exist within. To me, that is the ultimate work of Black futurisms globally. As always, I want to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to leave your comments below. Also, please share, like, subscribe, and visit our website and Patreon to get updates on how we're moving and to support us in building Blackly Imaginative community.